Praise the Lord. Well, thank you for the honor of sharing in this wonderful gathering. It is our pleasure to be here. It's been a while since we've attended one of these, not really through any lack of want or desire, but our personal circumstances have been interesting. We've been living out of suitcases for much of the last 4 years, and over 40 international flights, 50 or something like that, and different continents to serve our son, really. And if you want to know more about that, come and talk to me later, because I'm standing on a trapdoor, and in half an hour, Tony's going to press a button. So, I have to be clear on what I say, and I can't waffle. I like the way Tony hands out subjects. He gets Keith to talk about 100 years of church history in half an hour. He's given Grant the job of giving an exegesis on Revelation in half an hour. And he wants me to answer the question, what on earth is God doing in the world, in half an hour? So we believe in miracles in this part of the world. I'm going to read a little bit from Daniel 7. I cannot read the whole chapter. You can read it afterwards for sake of time. So I don't speed read, and I don't think you'd hear me if I did. So I'm going to read just the first couple of verses, and then down from verse 9 to verse 14. And I thought it would be good to have a little of the Bible at some point in this conference. After putting the Bible first, I thought it might be helpful. In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel saw a dream and visions in his mind as he lay on his bed. And then he wrote the dream down and related the following summary of it. Daniel said, I was looking in my vision by night, and behold, the four winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea. And great beasts, four great beasts, were coming up from the sea, different from one another. And then Daniel describes these four beasts, which represent empire, human empires, four different empires. And then he carries on in verse 9, and I kept looking until thrones were set up. And the Ancient of Days took his seat. His vesture was like white snow, and the hair of his head like pure wool. His throne was ablaze with flames, and its wheels were a burning fire. A river of fire was flowing and coming out from before him. Thousands upon thousands that were attending him, and myriads upon myriads were standing before him. The court sat, and the books were opened. So this is placing God at the center of these empires and establishing him as king and maker of all, and Lord of every empire. And then he goes on, verse 11, then I kept looking because the sound of the boastful words which the horn was speaking, this was one of the beasts was still speaking, and I kept looking until the beast was slain, and its body was destroyed and given to the burning fire. And the rest of the beasts, that's the other three, their dominion was taken away, but an extension of time was granted to them for an appointed period of time. So their influence continues. And I kept looking in night visions, and behold, with the sounds of heaven, one like the Son of Man was coming. And he came up to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion, glory, and a kingdom, that all the peoples, nations, and men of every language might serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which will not pass away, and his kingdom is one which will not be destroyed. Just a couple more verses. And I kept looking, and that horn was waging war with the saints and overpowering them. Verse 21. Until the Ancient of Days came, and judgment was passed in favor of the saints of the Most High, and the time arrived when the saints took possession of the kingdom. Now, I want to share a little around this. by the first kind of to introduce this subject of what on earth is God doing in the world. And I want to talk a little bit about the four winds. They come up in different places in the Bible, including in Revelation chapter 7, verse 1, where they are restrained by an angel so that the saints can be sealed. And this is important because we hear a lot about people being marked. And it tends to be the mark of the beast. But nobody talks about the mark of God, which is equally, if not more important. So I'll talk about the four winds and then how I see them playing out in the world today, briefly. And then I want to give a couple of urgent things that are upon my heart for the church, because we do live in unprecedented times. I heed what Tony said yesterday about revisiting what was 50 years ago, but there have been some fundamental tectonic shifts, and we really can't escape it. So when I think about what the church is, what God is doing, I really can't encapsulate the whole world because I don't live there. So I don't, even though we've gone on nearly 50 flights or whatever it is in 4 years, I really am Western in my mindset. So I want to address this subject from that point of view. And I see what God is doing in parts of the rest of the world that we're not living in as actually transforming the globe in which we live. You know, we've come, you know, I started going to South Africa years and years and years ago, and when I did, I remember I first went there, people continually talked to me about their concerns about China and the Soviet Empire and the red tide that was sweeping down the continent. And you know, when in 1948, when Mao Zedong took power, there were at most 3 million believers in China. The official church there now is 80 million. And that does not take into consideration the vast majority of believers who don't want to register as a part of the official church. It's probably twice that big. And that is in your lifetime. Some of you have lived through 1948 to now. I'm not far off. Not quite 80, but we're moving there. And that has just been a phenomenal adjustment. So we welcome China. There are certain things it does represent, because some of these winds of empire are blowing there. But God has been doing a phenomenal work. And similarly, in the Muslim world, of all the peoples of the earth, that was a part of the world that was most dark and most difficult to penetrate with the gospel. But in this last 20-odd years of this century, first 20 years, 17 years of this century, up to 6 million Muslims have found Christ in every single room of the House of Islam, because Islam is called the House of Islam. That's the whole of the Islamic world. And there are 9 rooms. So even into the most closed Arabic states, people are finding Christ in the hundreds and thousands. They had an imam on Al Jazeera a few years ago who urged greater diligence amongst Muslim brethren around the world, because he said that to his knowledge, 530 Muslims were turning to Christ and to the Messiah every day. That is conservative. It's probably far more than that. And that is just this last 17 years. And before that, there was almost nothing. Whole nations were closed to the gospel, because there is a breath of God happening. Now, let me say what I think he's doing in the West. I think he's pruning the church. I encourage you to go to a vineyard. Like Tony, I've had the privilege of going to Germany many times, and the area where I've been frequently, they grow vineyards and plant vines. And I would go often in the winter time, and I would walk in the vineyards to pray and to seek the Lord. And I'd often bump into a German farmer, and many of the farms in Germany are very small. and the farmers are part-time. So they come from work on their bikes, and they have their pruning shears, and they cut into these vines, and they reduce them to 2 small branches off all the foliage, because there's much of what we've embraced in terms of our structure, in terms of our methods, in terms of our message, that are not fit for purpose for the world we're heading into. They're not fit for purpose. Even a couple of our most profound doctrines, which I will talk about in a minute, they're not fit for purpose. And God is pruning the church. And I'm excited about it. I get asked what I see God doing, and I'm not alarmed. I see only exciting things taking place, because I feel that there has been a spread of the gospel in parts of the world that our eyes have been ignoring or been closed to, we haven't really seen. A rapid explosion in parts of the world which we've prayed for, which we've sought God for, and yet He's now answering, but we're not really seeing it. And they are coming with a dedication and a zeal, and they are helping to show up the needs of our church. Now, I was chatting with Chris Cole the other day. Every year, a plane load of Koreans come to Britain, taking their own time and their own holiday. 300 or 400 of them charter a jet, and they fly over for 2 weeks to pray for the country, because they recognize that it sowed the gospel from this country into Korea all those years ago, and they want to see the return of blessing upon the head of the church in Britain. I don't know such dedication. I haven't lived with that kind of passion. And they have it. And we live in such thrilling times. Now, these 4 winds. A wind, well, let's learn nature's lesson, because we are taught in Scripture that we look at the natural and then the spiritual, and the natural reveals the spiritual. It's first a grain, and then it's spiritual life, right? It's sown a natural seed, raised a spiritual one. So winds are natural forces, and they are neutral. They are very, very good, because without wind there would be no rain on the land. Everywhere would be desert. But you know, winds can be very destructive. Ask the residents of Puerto Rico or British Virgin Islands. 80% of their houses flattened. So winds can be destructive, and they can stir things up, or they can be positive and constructive, and God uses them. And I define these 4 forces in this way. Military power, philosophical and religious power, political power, and economic power. And they are 4 forces that have governed the history of mankind. They all have always played a part, but at different periods in history, different ones have prevailed more than others. So for the first many hundreds of years of human history, military power was the strongest force. But now we live in a time without question where economic interest and economic influence is by far the most important. So the Cold War, not a shot was fired between the Soviet Union and America and the Western allies. And yet it led to the collapse of one of the empires. So it wasn't by military might that this was done only, but it was by economic capacity and strength. And so we live, beloved, in a season of time of history where all of these things are being shaken. In the last 17 years of this century, each of these have gone through fundamental change. We started off in 2001, 9/11. And the nature of military power changed. We were no longer fearing a Soviet empire on the other side of an Iron Curtain. We were now fearing the snake in the grass at our feet. And the enemy had come out from its place over there, and it was now in our shopping malls, and on our walking streets, and on our bridges across from Parliament, and flying aircraft into our skyscrapers. So the nature of the military threat have significantly shifted, and you can ask any military strategist the world over, they are changing the way their armies are composed, because they're having to take note of a completely different type of threat. Then you had 2008 and 9. That brought a massive change in our understanding of economics. We had a banking and then a sovereign debt crisis because of greed and corrupt practice. Really. Bundles of insecure debt was wrapped up and sold as positive entities. And when that started to unravel, it created a run on currencies, a run on banks. Whole structures had to be supported with millions and millions of pounds, dollars of your money and mine into our children's pockets in future generations. Because there was a shaking in the economic structures of our world. Then that led and has led to continued and ongoing political uncertainty, discussion, and fragmentation. So the politics is changing. People are more distrusting of news broadcasts, of political figures, of political parties, and they are being more easily influenced by inappropriate promises and threats. Because they are fearful, and they are the nations, they are the sea. The water is being stirred up. There is unease, and they will look for security anywhere. I am not a Democrat in the way we have come to know it. I do not believe that the majority is right. We are not a democracy here, nor are you in America. We are a parliamentary constitutional democracy, and that is a huge difference. We are not governed by the will, the fears, and the angst of people, or shouldn't be. But things are being stripped away, which is creating a lot of political instability in Europe, in America, and in different parts of the world, because we are not grounded in our understanding. And we have released a tide. You know, we now live in a global village, as the saying goes. I like to look at it like this very quickly. In the old days, we used to go to a fair and come back with a goldfish in a plastic bag. And we would buy a little jar, a little round jar, and we would put the goldfish in the jar, and it would live for a little while, and that was great. And you could rock that jar and get it stable quite quickly. You could tip it up, but you could manage the water in it reasonably easily to bring it back to a place of stability. But now we poured all those jars into a big fish tank. And we have seen forces released that are beginning to rock the water of the fish tank. It has lots of goldfish in it. And they're all swimming around and they seem quite happy on the whole. But that water is rocking, and it is much more difficult to control that, isn't it? That can get out of control very quickly. And that is the place we're at, beloved, in my opinion. And it's a good place because the Ancient of Days is on the throne. And he is overseeing what's happening here. But we need to have an anchor beyond the veil. And we need to see more clearly about things than we have done before, because it's in times like this that people run scared, and then they make irrational decisions, and they vote for the wrong people. Right? And they don't think. And that's where Keith shared yesterday about having a burden for the common man, for the individual who's caught up in the forces and pressures of this world, because they are leaving casualties, and the church must be there to pick them up as best we can. But because of where we stand, I want to share a couple of things that I feel are really critical that we're clear about. I think it's most important that we understand and get a decent eschatology. I have been deeply concerned about many things that are put out there. People who write on the internet put out YouTube things and this, that, and the other. They attract millions of hits. Millions. And yet these people, no one knows really who they are. You don't know what their family's like, what their kids do. And that they're making grand statements which, in my opinion, are often very inaccurate and wrong. There are two men in the Bible who had a very clear understanding of who they were and the time in which they were sent. John the Baptist and Jesus. John the Baptist was clear because he had a rather unique birth. His dad was a priest, and he was offering incense on the altar, and he had a meeting, a rather unexpected meeting with Gabriel. And this man, his wife hadn't been able to have kids. And he was getting on in years, and Gabriel promised him a son and said, "You'll call him John, and he'll be a prophet of the Most High in the spirit and power of Elijah. And he will he will go before the Lord to prepare the way." And Zechariah was understandably quite skeptical. And God struck him dumb. And he went home and tried his best on a slate to tell his wife what had happened. And then she became pregnant. What do you think he thought about? He wasn't able to fill his house with doubt, with words of uncertainty. He wasn't able to, in any way, question. He didn't wonder if it was a girl or a boy. He didn't need a scan. He knew who it was. And the voice of the angel rang in his head for 9 months. So when his son was born, and he was asked who he was, what his name was, he said, "John." And then he came out of his mouth the most magnificent prophetic statement, prayer and prophecy about his son and about who Jesus was going to be. The sunrise from on high has visited us. What a description. The sunrise. We've been in darkness. It's been night. And the sunrise is coming. And my son is preparing the way. So when John comes, he's in absolutely no doubt who he is. He's not the prophet. He's not Elijah. He's not Messiah. He's the voice of one crying in the wilderness, because his father said so. And he comes and he preaches and he says, "The axe is laid at the root. But one comes after me who's mightier than I, whose sandals I'm not worthy to untie. And the winnowing fork is in his hand." What does winnowing fork do? It separates the wheat from the chaff. The person winnowing chooses a day where there's a bit of a breeze, and he throws up the grain into the air, and the chaff is blown away and destroyed, and the grain falls straight back down to the ground, and they collect it up. And he said, "I'm come to inspect the fruit of these trees. The axe is laid at the root." And Jesus comes, And he says, no, actually, John the Baptist was Elijah, if you care to listen. He said it twice. When Jesus says anything twice, you better listen. When he says things once, you better listen. But when he says it twice, he means it. He says it on two separate occasions. And if John was Elijah, who was he? Malachi chapter 4. They all know. John the Baptist and Jesus were not uncertain. They were as clear as could be. Before the great and terrible day of the Lord, I will send Elijah the prophet, and he will turn the hearts of fathers to sons and sons to fathers, lest I smite the land with a curse. That word is a ban or edict of destruction. So Jesus picks this theme up. Now, have you ever asked a few questions when you read the words of Jesus? He comes out with statements that actually challenge deeply what we believe. He says to his disciples 3 times in Matthew alone, you won't go through the cities of Israel before I come back. He says this, some of you won't taste death until you see the kingdom coming. This generation will not pass away until you see the kingdom coming. What does that do to your theology? Jesus and John were speaking in context. They were sent to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And Jesus, at the end of his life, comes to Jerusalem. And he prays for her. And he says, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you are unwilling. Therefore, this house is left to you desolate. What does that say to you? I've been to desolate places. I've been into wild deserts where there's nothing. I went to Joplin a few weeks after the hurricane, the tornado. 153 or so people lost their lives. A mile wide by 8 miles long strip of destruction went through the town of 20,000 people. Bark was peeled off trees. There wasn't a telephone pole standing in the town. Whole swathes of housing and industry and shop and commerce were flattened. The hospital was moved 3 inches off its foundation and was 6 stories high. Lost the top floor completely. That was desolation. So what's Jesus talking about that's going to happen in his lifetime, or within a generation of his lifetime? I'll tell you. He comes up to Jerusalem and his disciples comment on the buildings of the temple. And they say, incredible buildings, aren't they, Jesus? And Jesus says, yeah, they're great, but not one stone will be left upon another. And they ask him a question. They say, when will these things be? What will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? Matthew 24, verse 2. And we read that chapter, and it has all these wonderful descriptions in it. This flowery, poetic, metaphoric language. He's coming in the clouds. Every eye will see him. Sun will be darkened, and moon will be turned into blood before the great and terrible day of the Lord. And then he talks about the parable of the fig tree. Learn it, he says. And then he makes the comment about this generation not passing away until they see it. There's no doubt in my mind whatsoever that whatever else Jesus meant, and he may have meant some other things, I believe he did, but whatever he meant, it is clear to me that he was talking about the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. that John the Baptist knew that that was coming, that Jesus knew it was coming. He said, John chapter 1 says, that he came unto his own, but those who were his own received him not. But as many as received him, he gave the right to become children of God. I am absolutely convinced that we cannot project this passage into the future because we don't understand it. So we read it in our Western minds, and it's using flowery poetic language, very, very metaphorical. And do you know where the language comes from? Well, partly the passage I read in Daniel. He came in the clouds. But it's also two other passages which are hugely definitive. One's in Isaiah, the other is in, I think, Jeremiah, where those exact words, sun darkened, moon turned into blood, are used about God coming in judgment on two empires, on Egypt and on Babylon. So Jesus deliberately takes words that are used by the prophets that have gone before him to describe the destruction of a civilization. And he says it's coming here, within a generation of my lifetime. And we put it into the future because he talks about the end of an age. But whose age? There are ages in the Bible. The age that he was talking about was the end of Israel. And the end of him using that people as his primary vehicle for bringing the kingdom. That's not to say he's done away with Israel. Not at all. He loves the Jews, but he is not into real estate. It's not about the land. It's about the people. And they are absolutely a part of God's purpose. But he destroyed their nation. 40 years later, there was all kinds of upheaval which Daniel refers to. And the horn speaking and persecuting the church, which was almost certainly referring to Nero. And a cataclysmic period in Roman history, where they went through 3 emperors in a year. Nero and then a couple of others. And Vespasian had been sent to put down an uprising in Israel. And he had a huge army. And when the third of those Caesars lost his life because of political infighting within the Roman system, he left to take up the Caesarship back in Rome, and he left Titus in charge of the army, and he destroyed completely the city. They tore it apart. They left one wall. They salted the entire city and banned any Jew from living there. They took them all into slavery and used many of them to build a ramp up the side of Masada to get rid of the last rebellion. And the nation was disenfranchised of its land. That is what Jesus was primarily referring to, because that is the people he was at that point speaking to, addressing, and to whom he had been sent. And we put this all into the future because it uses all this language that we can't understand. And we look back in history and we think, has the sun ever been turned into blood? No. Well, it must be future then when Jesus is coming again. And we've come up with all kinds of convoluted ideas, which you know all about. And you're trying to warn your dear people about red blood moons and da-da-da-da-da-da. Beloved, let's get back to some essentials here. We have to start there. Now, I've got about 0 minutes. 5? 1. 1, okay. I want to say one other thing. Again, going back to understanding of Greek. Please, got one? I'm all right, thank you. The other point that I want to make is, in closing, is this. We have to refresh our understanding of the nature of God. Now, the Greeks, from whom we have gained a great deal, Aristotle, in all his wisdom, defined or identified 10 qualities of things, of all things. Starting with its substance. It's a tree. It's got substance. It's independent. It stands there. It's a tree. then the quantity, the quality, and then fourthly was the relationship. Now, the substance is the noun. And to the Greek, that was the most important. They wanted substance. Hebrews, the most important was always relationship. So as we began to try and come to terms with who God was, and it wasn't until the 2nd, 3rd century under Tertullian that we actually came with the term Trinity. We defined 3 persons. We wanted an objective God. We wanted a substantial God. We didn't want one that was just purely subjective because that didn't carry quite so much weight. So we defined his character and his nature. And we put him over there and we looked at him under a microscope, and then we looked at him through a telescope, and we tried to define his character and his nature. But beloved, you cannot get to know God like that. He can only be known and learnt about subjectively and relationally. God is not just 3 persons. He is a dance. He is a dance. Father and Son dancing to the tune of the Spirit. And he wants you to join in. He throws out his hand. He doesn't want you to observe from a distance and try and define how you see him. He wants you to enter into that dance so that you can become a part of that expression. And there is no word for personality in Hebrew, as we have it, individual person, defined, blonde hair, blue eyes, Caucasian or black or whatever. No. They only understood people in the context of their relationships. That's why you have genealogies and family and who they are and where they came from. And we have to understand that God wants to break into your heart with a greater seeing of who he is, a greater relating to him on the way that he's called you to relate, and a greater capacity to enter into that dance with him so that you can share who he is. He expresses himself to you in Hebrew as his face. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. Lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. I wait for the Lord who is hiding his face from the house of Israel. I'll even look eagerly for him, says the prophet. So God wants us to understand that he comes to us in 3 faces. And each have a different place and a different role. But he wants us to see the faces of God. And he wants to enter into that because we behold him face to face as in a mirror. So what you believe about God, you'll reflect. As Tony said yesterday, he's still counseling young men who believe that if their business fails, God's angry with them. Because we have a Greek mindset. We somehow have a Zeus up there who casts down arbitrary thunderbolts when he's not happy. And we have to have God as a divine dance. And we can thank Floyd McClung and Tony Fitzgerald for introducing fathers to us and Father God to us. Because nothing was written about that until the last handful of years in church history. So, beloved, take these things. We live in a surprising, exciting, stupendous time. And thanks very much for the opportunity to share.